Ray Dalio, thanks for joining me.
So glad to be here.
So big book, not a surprise, and you are looking at the state of the planet and some significant changes that put all together most of us have not seen in our lifetimes. Three, I want to get through all three of them before we get into detail. Let's start with number one, increasing and you think increasingly unsustainable levels of debt.
Yeah, the three things that together got me to do this research of the patterns of the last 500 years so I could understand it were the enormous levels of debt creation and debt monetization when you hit zero interest rates and you can't ease through lowering interest rates. So I needed to study the rises and declines of the value of money and currencies in the cycles. The second was the internal conflict, the risk to democracy. The measures that I used showed that the largest wealth gaps and political gaps since 1900 in that internal conflict. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power and the existing world order, the rise of China and challenging that. And I learned before that many things that surprised me in my life happened not in my lifetime, but before. So I needed to see those cycles and those patterns going back to about 500. So the first one, as you're pointing out, the large production of debt and debt monetization is an area that I specialized in, and in terms of understanding as a global macro investor. And that produces what we're seeing in a mechanical way, which means that the value of money goes down. In other words, you could look at it very simply, that if the quantity of money and credit, which is buying power, increases faster than the quantity of goods and services and financial assets, that the prices of goods, services, and financial assets will rise, the value of money will go down. And so we see that happening now. We're in the part of the cycle for that in which everybody received a lot of checks and all that money coming in, and people's paper net worth then went up because you got more money. And we're not used to inflation. But what is happening is then you're in that part of the cycle where there's that inflation pressure in goods, services, and financial assets. And what that has to do is then cause reactions. And those reactions are along the lines like people no longer will want to hold cash investments. They will not want to hold bond investments because those will start to have a negative real return. And as that inflation psychology and that investment psychology changes, it changes the movement of money. So it worsens the supply-demand picture for money. So you are seeing the beginning of a supply-demand imbalance.
Do you think we've passed the tipping point? Do you think that the role of the dollar as global reserve currency is long-term fundamentally unsustainable because of debt that's already been taken on?
The role of the dollar as a storehold of wealth, there's two purposes of a currency, a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. And because of the imbalances and the supply demand that is baked in as we now need it, and also take the political issues and the types of spending that are being demanded, required, I might say, that means that imbalance will exist. And so you are, I think, for the foreseeable future, that it will not be an effective storehold of wealth, as it is now not an effective storehold of wealth. That drives not just to other currencies, there are other currencies, but other countries are in this type of position too, to some extent. And so you see Europe and Japan, which have the three old currencies and so on, in somewhat similar positions. So you see the poor storehold of wealth being reflected in other items going up because you measure them in dollars. but it's really the currency is going down. So we've entered a period of time in which the question will be, what will be the money of the future? What will be the monies of the future? Increasingly, there will be a competition of monies as a storehold of wealth. There'll be competitions for storeholds of wealth. Now, that could be your real estate. It could be your stocks. It could be your gold. It could be your Bitcoin. Those are the choices. But those assets as a whole will you'll see the movement into those. You will, in other currencies, such as China's renminbi, you will see gradually an increase in the usage of those currencies at the same time. But don't just look at it as other currency. Look at it as other storeholds of wealth.
And you would argue that some of the explosion of excitement over Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is just this general desire to move away, to diversify away from the dollar for the reasons you're mentioning.
That's right, because a dollar, a cash, and a bond, which is a promise to receive dollars, are being depreciated. And that's right. So you will see those as digital gold. You will see other currencies. You'll see probably China's renminbi, which will increasingly they'll have a digital renminbi, and there'll be choices.
So let's move to the second point, and that's just the significant and structural divides that we're increasingly seeing inside of democracies, and of course mostly in the world's most powerful democracy, the United States. Talk about why this is one of the factors that you consider such a big driver for a changing global order. Well,
it started with the populism that became more apparent when Donald Trump first came in. Populism didn't exist much in the developed world and didn't exist in the U.S. And I needed to study it. Populism of the left and populism of the right. And what I meant is, or what I mean by populism is the person of the left or the right, the leader, who will fight for that group in a fight against the other group. So history has shown that populism of the populists of the left and populists of the right then begin to gain power under this set of circumstances when there's a large wealth gap and there's the financial part. So it became very relevant to me because it changed how the wealth pie was being shifted. So, for example, when Donald Trump came in, tax changes had a big impact on financial markets, and as a result, you could see it, reverberate, and you could also see what was happening between states start to change. So I needed to study that conflict, and I plotted it, both the wealth gaps, the income gaps, and I plotted the political gaps, and all of those were the greatest since the 1930 to 45 period. In fact, greater than that period, going back to 1900. And we could see it every day. What was happening on January 6th was not a surprise in that this readers of history would see this pattern happen. And as we look forward, we can see that threat to democracy and the inclination to have a type of civil war occurring. For example, it's entirely possible that neither party will accept losing on the presidential elections in 24. So if that's amazing, right? Because then you lose rule of law, you lose the Constitution as being, you move to a phase where there is power, that it is a matter of power and a matter of fighting to win at all costs.
Ray, when you look at the last 2 years of pandemic and the fact that, labor rates, wages have gone up significantly as a response, people talk about the Great Resignation, there's been a significant amount of money that's gone towards redistribution and the rest. Would you say, I understand that undermines your first issue of indebtedness, but on the second point, do you think this is just a blip, or does it have the potential to be a more structural change that could actually improve the the levels of inequality and disenfranchisement that you're describing?
No, they go together. That's right. In other words, I do believe that the opportunity gaps, the education gaps, it's part of this cycle. Capitalism in its cycles creates great resource allocation, empowers people who don't have money. They get the money as they're good investments and so on. And it raises incomes, raises living standards, and it raises wealth gaps. And when it raises the wealth gap, because it's self-perpetuating, because people who earn the money, earn more money, can educate their children better and so on, and there are education gaps and so on, naturally those gaps widen and occur, and they are a problem. And so I understand those problems. I can see those problems. So the need to build infrastructure, the need to build better education and greater equality in education has to, by the way, also accompany greater productivity if you want to raise living standards.
So now we'll get to the most challenging piece of all of this in some ways, which is the fact that this is not happening in a bubble. It's happening while another country is on track with a very different political system, a very different economic system, and going to, in all likelihood, be the largest economy in the world by the end of the decade. Of course, you and I are talking about China. Are you someone who, looking at a medium to long-term projection, would be betting, I mean, all other things equal, let's leave aside that you're an American citizen, all the rest. Just as a capitalist, would you be betting more on the Chinese system than the American system or even the Western system writ large long-term at this point?
Well, I can say the following. It's not so simple. I think if the United States was at its best, it's a hell of a system, but they've got us outnumbered. You know, there are more than four times as many Chinese as there are Americans. And so that means if per capita income goes to half what it is in the United States, China will be twice as large. So China, and China's growing at a faster rate than the United States is. So most of those things say what you have is a big, effective competitor. I started to go to China. I know China very well since 1984 I started to go. And when I first went there, I would bring $10 calculators to people, and they never saw anything like that. Leaders of companies and government officials, and they thought they were miracle devices. And now in quantum computing and AI and so on, they're competitors. Since I started going there, per capita income has increased by 26 times. The life expectancy has increased by 10 years. The poverty rate has gone from 88% to less than 1%. It's certainly a powerful competitor, okay? And in that regard, and it's a bigger country, and bigger means more powerful too. So that's a tough competitor. And I don't know that the United States is doing its best in terms of being an effective competitor in its various ways. In many ways, yes, but in many ways, no, because we're also at each other's throats and we have these financial issues. And so at the end of the day, it will be just simply a matter of who is most powerful. And most powerful will really be primarily determined on how we are with ourselves.
If labor is no longer as important going forward, and increasingly we're looking at technology, that would imply that whether you have 1.4 billion or 400 million, the big thing that both the Americans and the Chinese have going for them is that they dominate all the technologies and nobody else does. That implies a more bipolar investment pattern, no?
That's right. But when you look at it, the Chinese are turning about 8 times as many engineers out as we are, the United States. The population is bigger. It's certainly a competitor, and we certainly have to do everything we can to be strong. And that's why when I think about it, I'm 72 years old, and the America that I remember is a different, and grew up with, is a different America than it exists today in terms of like equal opportunity and the American dream, and then and us working in a sense together and doing amazing things like the space program and so on, those types of things. I'm not saying we're not doing terrific things. The best American universities are the best universities in the world, and there's a handful of those. But if you take the population as a whole and you look at the educational levels and those types of things, we have the problems we're talking about.
The book is Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. The man is Ray Dalio, and I want to thank you for joining me on GZERO World.
Thank you, Ian.